Ready to dive into the UK Constitution. We've got a ton of readings for this deep dive.
It's fascinating stuff, really.
Yeah, and it's way more interesting than it might sound at first glance.
Yeah, because it's not your typical constitution.
Yeah.
We're not talking about one big document.
Oh, so no fancy constitution like the US.
Exactly. Think of it more as a puzzle with pieces scattered throughout history.
Okay, so no single document. But there are still rules, right?
Absolutely. We'll be looking at how statutes, court decisions, and even these things called conventions, basically unwritten rules, shape the UK Constitution. They really influence how the government operates.
Unwritten rules. Sounds a bit risky, doesn't it? What if someone just decides to ignore them?
Well, that's where things get interesting. We'll unpack all that later. But first, let's start with statutes.
So, like the laws we're used to.
Yes, laws passed by Parliament. And they cover major constitutional issues. For instance, devolution, the transfer of power to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland.
Right, giving them more control over their own affairs. So, Parliament passes these statutes, and that shapes the Constitution.
Exactly. And some of these statutes are really old, like the Magna Carta from 1215. That's centuries before America even existed.
Wow, 1215. You think our laws are old. Okay, so statutes are one piece of the puzzle. What else?
Next, we have case law or common law. This is where judges come in. They don't just apply the law, they interpret it. And sometimes their decisions actually shape the Constitution itself.
Wait, judges can change the Constitution? I thought that was Parliament's job.
Well, in the UK system, judges have a significant role.
Okay.
Their interpretations can set precedents that become part of the law. It's like they're filling in the gaps, clarifying the written laws.
So it's all about interpretation.
Yes. A good example of this is RVR in 1991.
Okay, tell me more about that case.
Before RVR, marital rape wasn't a crime in England and Wales.
Really?
But the House of Lords, then the highest court, decided that a husband could be charged with raping his wife.
So they basically said, this old law doesn't work, we're changing it.
Precisely. It shows how the courts adapt the law to reflect changing values.
Wow, so one case can make a huge difference.
Absolutely. RVR wasn't just about legal definitions. It forced society to confront truths about power dynamics within marriage.
Interesting. It really highlights the power of the courts.
Indeed. Now, we've covered statutes and case law, both written down. Let's move to those unwritten rules, the constitutional conventions.
Okay, remind me, what are these conventions and how do we know they exist?
That's the thing. Even defining them is a debate among scholars. Basically, conventions are the unspoken rules, the norms that have developed over time to guide how the government operates.
Okay, so they're like the unwritten rules of the game. But if they're not written down, how do people even know what they are? It seems easy to ignore them.
Well, there's a reason these conventions have persisted. One expert, Professor Jennings, suggested 3 questions to identify a convention. First, has this happened before? Second, did people feel obligated to act that way? And third, is there a good reason for it? Does it serve a purpose? If it's a yes to all 3, you're likely looking at a convention.
Okay, so it's not random. There's history and logic behind it. But if there's no legal punishment for breaking a convention, what's stopping someone from saying, nope, not following that one?
The consequences might not be legal, but they can be very real. Imagine a politician tossing aside a long-standing convention. There would be a backlash from the public, their party, even the monarch. A loss of trust, political instability, even calls for resignation.
Oh, I see. It's like peer pressure, but on a national scale.
Exactly. No one wants to break the unwritten rules. Let's look at some concrete examples of conventions in action.
Sounds good. Like what?
Well, one of the most interesting areas where conventions are at play is the royal prerogative.
Hold on, the royal prerogative, doesn't that refer to the powers of the monarch? So the queen still has actual power.
Technically, yes, but this is where conventions come in. Well, the monarch still has these powers. Conventions dictate how those powers are exercised.
Okay.
Take royal assent, for example. The monarch can give royal assent to bills passed by Parliament, making them law. But by convention, the Queen never refuses to give royal assent.
Wait, so even if Parliament passes a law the Queen hates, she has to sign off on it?
Exactly. It's a formality, but an important one. It symbolizes the relationship between the monarch and Parliament.
That's a really clever way of balancing the power, then.
It ensures that ultimately the elected representatives hold the real power.
That makes sense. What other examples are there of the royal prerogative being governed by conventions?
Well, the appointment of the prime minister. The monarch technically has the power to choose, but by convention, they always appoint the leader of the party that wins a majority in the House of Commons.
So the people indirectly choose the prime minister through their votes. It's all connected. Any other key
Oh,
conventions?
loads. We'll get to those later. But for now, conventions cover many areas, from how the government interacts with parliament to how ministers are held accountable for their actions. Fascinating stuff.
Okay, my brain is officially full for now. But before we wrap up, I have to ask, if these conventions are so important, why not just write them down, make them official laws?
That's the million-dollar question. There are strong arguments on both sides. Some argue that codifying conventions would make things more transparent and accountable, while others worry it would make the system too rigid. We'll delve into that next time.
All right, can't wait. We've covered statutes, case law, and even those mysterious constitutional conventions. It's amazing how much history and complexity is packed into the UK Constitution. We've only just scratched the surface, though.
Absolutely. There's much more to uncover.
Let's take a break and come back to this fascinating topic in part 2.
It's interesting, isn't it? This reliance on unwritten conventions says a lot about the UK's political culture.
How so?
Well, it suggests a high level of trust in those in power, like a belief that they'll act in good faith, even when they're not legally bound to do so.
It's like the system is built on a handshake, not a contract. But what happens when that trust breaks down? What if someone, decides to take advantage of that flexibility?
That's the big question. It's why the debate about codifying conventions is so important.
Right, I see that now.
It's about balancing flexibility with the need for clarity, accountability.
Yeah, making sure those in power don't overstep.
Absolutely. Are there any specific conventions that come to mind that have caused controversy or debate? Like real-world examples where things get tricky?
Well, what about the relationship between the government and parliament? That seems like it could be a bit of a minefield.
You're right. That's a good one. Take the Convention of Collective Ministerial Responsibility, for example.
Collective ministerial responsibility. That sounds intense.
Basically, it means the cabinet members have to publicly support the government's decisions.
Even if they disagree.
Even if they disagree privately, yes.
Wow, so no going rogue.
It's about presenting a united front and maintaining public confidence.
So what happens if a minister feels strongly about something? Like their conscience just won't let them stay silent?
That's when things get really interesting. We've seen cases where ministers have resigned over this.
Because they couldn't support the government's policies.
Exactly. It's a tough choice. Loyalty to the team or standing up for what you believe in.
It's a real dilemma. Okay, what about individual ministers and parliament? Is there a convention for that too?
Yes, there is. That's where individual ministerial responsibility comes in.
Okay, and that one means?
It means ministers are accountable to Parliament for their actions and the actions of their departments.
So if something goes wrong, the minister takes the blame.
In theory, yes, but it can be a bit blurry sometimes.
How so?
Well, there's debate about how much responsibility a minister should have for the mistakes of their civil servants, for instance.
I can see how that would be tricky. It's not always clear who's responsible.
Right. It's definitely a recipe for debate. Are there any other conventions we should touch on?
Are there any that specifically relate to the House of Lords?
Actually, yes. The Salisbury Convention. This one deals with how the House of Lords, the upper chamber of Parliament, handles legislation proposed by the government.
Interesting. So the House of Lords can't just block anything the government wants to do.
Well, not exactly. The Salisbury Convention says that the Lords won't oppose a government bill if it was in the governing party's election manifesto.
Ah, so it's about respecting what the people voted for.
Yeah. It ensures that the House of Lords, which is unelected, doesn't obstruct the will of the elected government.
Okay, that makes sense.
It's about balance, really.
Yeah, it seems like all these conventions have a lot of nuance to them.
That's a great way to put it. The UK Constitution relies on understanding these unwritten rules, respecting traditions.
And having that shared commitment to democracy.
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
complex and dynamic, always evolving.
So we've got statutes, case law, and conventions. Anything else we need to consider to really understand the UK Constitution?
Well, it's crucial to remember that the UK Constitution is constantly evolving. It's not a static document. It adapts to changing circumstances and societal values.
It's a work in progress.
Exactly. That's what makes it so fascinating.
It's more than just a set of rules, then.
Yeah, it's a reflection of the country's history, struggles, and evolution as a democracy.
That's a great point. We've covered so much in this deep dive. Statutes, case law, and those fascinating conventions. It's clear how much history and complexity is packed into the UK Constitution.
It truly is a journey through time at the heart of what it means to be British.
Okay, but with all of this said, why should the average person care? Why does the UK Constitution even matter to everyday life?
That's a great question. And the answer is simple. It affects every aspect of our lives.
Really?
Oh, absolutely. It shapes how we're governed, what rights we have, how we can hold those in power accountable.
So it's not just some abstract legal concept.
No, not at all. Understanding it is about being informed citizens and participating in our democracy.
I see. So it's about understanding the foundations of our society and our rights as individuals.
Exactly. And recognizing that the Constitution isn't set in stone. It's a living thing that we all play a part in shaping.
This has been incredible. We've learned so much about the UK Constitution in this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure sharing this with you.
We've covered statutes, case law, conventions. Now, what's the one big question you want our listeners to think about as they explore this topic further? So it's all about trust in the system.
Yeah. The UK Constitution relies on this balance of power, tradition, and trust.
And as we've seen, conventions can be flexible.
Right, but that also leaves room for things to be a bit ambiguous, maybe even misused.
Okay, so what's the big takeaway here for our listeners?
I think a question for everyone is that balance still working? You know, the balance between flexibility and tradition.
And if it isn't, what then?
Well, then maybe it is time to consider making those unwritten rules a bit more, explicit.
You mean like actually writing them down, codifying the conventions?
Exactly. It's a big debate, of course. Lots of arguments on both sides.
Yeah, we touched on that earlier. Some people want more transparency.
Right, and more accountability. But then others worry about becoming too rigid.
Losing that flexibility that's been so important to the UK system.
Exactly. It's a tough one. There's no easy answer.
So where do you think this is all headed? I mean, based on everything we've discussed so far.
Honestly, I think the UK Constitution is entering a new chapter.
What do you mean?
Well, there are so many ongoing debates,
Mhm.
about power, about the role of conventions, about citizens' rights.
It feels like a lot is changing.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I think the conversation about the future of the Constitution is far from over.
So you're saying we might actually see some big changes.
We might. Whether the UK decides to codify or finds new ways to clarify those unwritten rules, it'll be fascinating to see what happens.
It really is like we're watching history unfold.
It is, and that's what's so exciting about studying the UK Constitution.
It's not just something in the past.
No, it's a living, breathing system that's still evolving, and it affects everyone in the UK.
This deep dive has been an incredible journey. We've unpacked statutes, case law, conventions,
It's been a pleasure.
and we've explored what makes the UK Constitution so unique.
It's a fascinating system, really.
So as we wrap things up, what's the one message you want our listeners to take away? What should they keep in mind?
I'd say the UK Constitution isn't just something to learn about. It's something to engage with.
What do you mean by that?
It reflects our history, our values, our journey as a democracy. So keep exploring, keep questioning, keep participating in the conversation.
Because ultimately, we all have a stake in shaping the future of the UK Constitution.
Exactly.
Well said. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the UK Constitution. It's been a fascinating journey. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. Keep those questions coming, and until next time, happy exploring.